When Diane asked me if I would do a presentation in Boston a few years ago about losing my child, I wasn't sure then if I could. Now, however, I feel even more ready to spread God's word. And through all the heartache and sorrow, there really is hope. I thank the Lord for my faith, as it was the only thing that got me through my tragedy. And without it, I would clearly be lost. I often have to remind myself to trust and believe the Lord has a path for me, to follow and surrender my doubts and be patient, for I will see and understand. It's hard to know where to begin, really. It's been 8.5 years of waking up every morning and saying to myself, I can't believe Jameis is dead. How did this happen? The nightmare that became a reality. It took a long time to be able to talk about the brutal murder without falling apart. The senseless loss in the hands of another human being, a person with mental illness, mixed with rage, jealousy, alcohol, and firearms. Jameis, my middle son, was 28 when he was murdered, along with his dad. Steve was my former husband. I was married for 20 years. Jameis was just visiting his dad, as he often did on that cold November day. I didn't know if I was going to mention this premonition, but I think I'm going to now. That day, I was going to work. And there's a spot in the road where a friend of mine's son went off the road, and a steep embankment, and his car went down into a freezing. It was in December, and the car went plummeting down the embankment, and the car went into the river. And he lived, but he now is mentally challenged and just went through a gamut of just hospitalization. And every time I pass that curve, I say to myself, gosh, Deb, how did she get through that? How on earth did she get through that with her son? And years ago, her mother had committed suicide as well. Tragic, tragic incidents. And I said, I know that nothing like this would ever happen to me because God knows that I'm not a strong person. And how many times have I heard God only gives you only what you're able to handle? So that day I went to work, and Jameis, he stopped by the office where I worked. It was a doctor's office, and he told me he was going up to his dad's to do his laundry and take his dog, Ellie, his border collie, for a walk. I clearly remember him being very happy and relieved that he had just stacked all the winter wood, the firewood for the wood stove for the winter. I then felt his dry, chapped hands. That was the last time I would see Jameis alive, as the next time I touched his cold hand in the funeral parlor, as I wept uncontrollably. Jameis was a gentle soul with quick wit and a wry sense of humor. He majored in art and psychology and was planning on returning back to school in the spring for his master's degree. Jameis was a puppeteer, and he held workshops in the art of puppeteering, shadow puppets. And he created these puppets and did work mainly with younger children. It was a form of ancient entertainment, and he was very intrigued in creating these puppets and using a projector to do the movement. His last performance was at a wedding a month before he died. I'll always remember the smiling faces of the children who gathered around and watched while he worked his magic on the screen. Jameis was incredibly humble and very sensitive to all living things. He he worked for a while in a greenhouse, and the owner was a gruff Vermonter who didn't really understand Jameis, especially when Paul would take the any insects or spiders and crush them and stomp on them if they were on the vegetables, and he wouldn't have anything to do with saving these little creatures. And Jameis would sneak around and pick off all the spiders or whatever he can find, and sneak down into the greenhouse. He was often seen collecting and bringing the little spiders and bugs down and putting them on plants so Paul wouldn't kill them. He was a strict vegetarian and couldn't imagine killing animals for food consumption. Jameis blessed his food every meal. He would have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and he would genuflect. He was religious in his own respect, but he studied all religions. He had the prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi on his nightstand. It was laminated with clear packing tape. I have it. It's precious to me. I would always cherish the times when he was home from college, and I would be at Mass, and he'd sneak in and stand next to me. But I'd have to remind him to take off his beret. The boys, so Jameis had two other brothers, and they were raised, in real rural Vermont, small town. Everyone knew each other. And at the time, his dad, Steve, was working in the town office. It was he was a lister. It's an elected position. And he met and fell into a very toxic relationship with another town employee. To this day, I just can't say her name. And over time, family and friends became concerned about the relationship. There was some really alarming behavior. Jameis told me once that she hit his dad over the head with a piece of firewood. And then there was reports, supposedly she drew a gun on Steve. It was in the nightstand. When Steve finally ended the relationship, knowing that things were not going well, he told her to pack up her things and move out. She became outraged and angered by a situation she could no longer control. That night, she shot and killed Jameis and Steve. Jameis, a victim of circumstances, was shot in the back of the head. Steve was plummeted with bullets. It wasn't until later that night, at about 3 a.m, that I received a phone call from my oldest son. And I'll never, ever forget the sound of his voice and the fear with that phone call.
I can't hear her.
Susan, you got muted. Please unmute yourself.
Where did I end up?
You were talking, your husband had been shot.
Okay. And Jameis was shot.
You're muted again, Susan.
Change why it keeps muting. Okay. So he went through the conversation and told me about what happened, and I just collapsed on the floor. And he told me that Jameis and Steve had been murdered, and I just kept saying no, and he just kept saying yes. So a little while later, these plainclothes policemen came to the door. I mean, I was in shock. I didn't know how to respond. The only thing I had to know, and the only thing I begged them for information, I had to know that Jameis didn't suffer. And they couldn't really answer me, but deep down, I knew that God would not let Jameis suffer. I knew that in my heart. Following days were just a total blur. Phone calls. Thank God for my partner, Lance, who just screened everything, and just the visitors flocked and to the house. People tried to console me and looking for answers and to questions I couldn't answer. I didn't really leave my bed, and the doctor and two nurses where I worked came and tried to help me with some homeopathic remedies, injections, milk baths, things of that nature that they used to treat shock patients. But I couldn't stop shaking. Nothing worked. And then I started to say the Lord's Prayer. And halfway through, the shaking stopped. And I just, yeah, I completely stopped. I continually ask myself, how could this have happened? Something like this, just doesn't happen in a tiny town in Vermont. The community was devastated. The celebration of life was widely attended, the standing room only, and it was, the mourners were overflowed out into the lawn. I was really worried about my other two sons at that point. They lost their dad and their brother, and I think that was one of the hardest things for me to fathom is me being, I was so numb and unable to breathe for so long, and depressed, like all of you, I'm sure. And you just have you ask yourself, how do you go on? I ask myself constantly, why? Every day a struggle. No experience prepares you for anything like this. And I felt ostracized, going out into the community, for fear of people asking questions, hugging me, and knowing, why, yeah. The worst, I think, was when people would just decide that they just needed to say something. And it was things like, oh, well, at least you have other children, or you're strong. Your life will never be the same. Like, that one bothered me tremendously. Stay busy. Get back to work. Isn't it time to get over it? And I know, I mean, I was angry, but I know that they were just trying to help, and sometimes not really knowing anything to say. But it was difficult. It was really difficult going back. I didn't actually go back to work. Ironically, it was sad. The doctor that I worked for, there was two of them, he told me that if I couldn't go back to work 100%, then I couldn't go back. He sent me this letter after I asked for a letter of recommendation. Clearly, I wasn't going back, and he said the employment was the best thing for me to seek right now. It would give me an opportunity to heal psychologically, as detailed in a Bo Rin Ra's book, The Book of Solace. And he puts strong emphasis on focusing on my work and the contact that brings me with other people. He said it provides me with means to take your focus off myself and your troubles and connect again with the real life rather than the virtual reality we make up for ourselves via our ego. So that was a slap in the face, but I continued to just surround myself with my loved ones, feeling like I was crazy, still going crazy, and countless times looking for some sort of relief. Very tempted to drown myself in with alcohol, but I continued to search for any help in any way to somehow validate how I was feeling. I scoured the internet for books, poems, prayers, anything that would somehow allow me to feel normal again. I decided to attend a local grievance meeting called Compassionate Friends. There was a couple about my age that told me their sad story about the loss of their son, who tragically fell from a steep embankment 5 years earlier. I thought to myself, 5 years ago, they're still grieving and coming to these meetings. I said, wow, I can't imagine grieving that long. Boy, was I wrong. I was so wrong. There's no time limit. Each of us going through our own difficult journey, taking our own time, and however we need to feel somewhat whole again. Many of us experience, just great anger, some guilt, profound heartache, and grief. And this just being a direct result from the unconditional love for our children. Months had passed, and I received a phone call from an old friend, Gwen. She was my best friend in high school, and she was from New Jersey, and she told me about the Jimenez ministry in Boston. And she had attended, and it was so helpful for her. Her son Frank had died of cancer a year earlier. She encouraged me, and I participated at the weekend retreat. And she even volunteered to come pick me up in Vermont, but I did decide to go. We met up. But it was right after meeting Diane and Charlie that I felt their love and knew immediately why I was there. I think the hardest thing was to see in the end, in the chapel, James's face on a lit candle in the chapel, along with countless others on the last day. But then I didn't feel alone anymore, and I thank God for that. Over the years, I've had opportunities to share with other parents who've also lost a child. There's always that parents that would comment or compare the method or the manner of how our children, how they died. And they would always say to me, "Oh, well, yours is such an unspeakable murder," and it was worse than mine. And I would quickly correct them, and it doesn't matter how they died. Mine might have maybe another layer of grief, but all loss is equal. Due to my very tragic, traumatic way that my son died, the doctor did recommend psychotherapy, and I for PTSD. So I did do that for a while, and I had regular sessions. But what was the absolute most helpful for me was meeting Caroline. I feel totally blessed. She was a therapist right in in our small little hospital. Excuse me for a minute. And she encouraged faith and the importance of prayer, but most important, she reminded me constantly that I would see Jameis again. And that was huge for me. It wasn't until 2.5 years after the murders that the court date had been set. It would last for 3 weeks, and I had no intention at all at first going. I couldn't sit. I couldn't sit in the courtroom with evil, let alone hearing and reliving the tragic events. But I knew if I stayed home, I would have even more anxiety, wondering the outcome of each day. So I had an arrangement with the district attorney that whenever there was graphic details, more than I could handle, they signaled me to leave. It was pretty grueling, the 3 weeks, especially not knowing for sure, I mean, how the jury would rule. But on that final day, the judge stated the verdict: life without parole. I wept with joy. And on the day of the arraignment, the judge had tears in her eyes as she listened to our family's impact statements. My statement consisted only of the prayer of Francis of Assisi: make me an instrument of thy peace. For it is in pardoning that we are pardoned. But how could I forgive? I knew then it was a message from Jameis and a message for me. By forgiving, we learn compassion. I continue to thank the Lord for signs that Jameis leaves me. And I can't emphasize and strongly encourage for you to cherish the signs that your child leaves for you or has left for you. Some parents were fortunate enough to have their child appear in their dreams. Others, a vision, a smell, sighting of butterflies and rainbows, or a song that you both shared would come on the radio at the exact time that you were thinking of your child. Reflect on these signs, especially when you're feeling overwhelmed with sadness. These are not coincidences, but your precious child's way of communicating with you and saying hello, reminding you that you will see each other again. I look back now and I'm grateful, so grateful I managed to get where I am today. That hope has kept me alive. It's not that I don't feel the pain. It's there. It's different. There's this quote that I've adopted from this book called "The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry." He had lost his wife, and instead of walking into the hole in the road, I now walk around it. So I'm going to turn everything over to Diane. There's a speaker. It's a speaker. It's a motivational speaker that I often close my eyes and listen to, especially when I'm feeling just overwhelmed and just totally sad. But it really warms my heart that I perhaps could offer some comfort to any of you tonight with this most difficult journey. And there's a if anyone is interested, a good friend of James's made this incredible YouTube video of James. It's called The Puppet King. And if you feel like visiting the YouTube, you'll get to see his smiling face, and it's a wonderful tribute. Thank you.
I ask people to do a simple exercise, and so I'll ask you. Are you in this room speaking to me right now in the physical presence of all the people in your life who are living right now, sharing life with you, sharing breath with you? Are they in this room? Could you introduce me to them? Could I go and shake their hand? Could they put their arms around me if they like me, or slap me if they didn't? The answer is always no. You didn't bring them with you. You're here as a lone interviewer, right? Or a lone attendee of a conference. Well, when you left, your children, your spouse, your parents, your best friends, whoever you left to come here to do this interview, did you stop loving them? Did they stop loving you? Do you think they did? And the answer is always, no, I didn't stop loving them. I still love them, even though they're not in the room. They haven't stopped loving me, even though they're not here with me. Well, how do we love them in separation? We think about them. We remember them. We talk about them. We appreciate them. We laugh with them. We cry with them. We admire them. We take inspiration from them. We wonder about them. We puzzle over them. We feel different for having known them. We appreciate them. We cherish them. We criticize them. We do all kinds of things in interaction with, or in some kind of interaction with persons who we love, who aren't in the room with us. Well, we can do all of those things after a person has died. The only things we can't do are the things that require physical, person-to-person interaction. We can't touch them. We cannot see them face to face. We cannot hear their voices as they actually speak and so on. But in memory, we can even do a fair amount of that. Or an old friend comes and asks a question about a memory that you had forgotten, and you'll go back to the sadness. So you never eliminate sadness. You don't get closure on sadness, all right? And you don't get closure on loving the person who died, as if anybody would want that. You don't need it, it's not desirable, and you don't have to go there. In my sadness, she's still with me. In my loneliness, he's still with me. And I think the heart of grief is learning how we already hold people in other places besides those sad places. And that kind of loving never has to stop. And remembering is a wonderful thing.